Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
You know that sinking feeling when someone tells you something so out of the blue that it turns your whole world upside down? That's what happened to me when my sister casually told me, "You know you're adopted, right?" I thought she was joking, until my parents confirmed it was true. And that was just the beginning. It started on one of those unremarkable Sundays, the kind where time drags and the house feels heavy with boredom. My sister and I were sprawled out in the living room, half watching some rerun on TV and scrolling through our phones. The air was quiet except for the occasional sound of her chuckling at a meme or me tapping a reply to a group chat. Then, out of nowhere, she broke the silence with a comment that changed everything. "I'm surprised you haven't figured it out yet," she said, not even looking up from her phone. "Figured what out?" I asked, barely paying attention. "That you're adopted," she said, her tone as casual as if she were commenting on the weather. For a second, I thought I misheard her. I let out a laugh, expecting her to crack a grin and follow up with some kind of punchline. Instead, she finally glanced at me with a look so serious it made my stomach drop. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice suddenly sharp. "I mean, come on," she said, shrugging. "It's not like they've done a great job hiding it. You don't look anything like mom or dad." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I froze, my mind scrambling to make sense of what she was saying. Was this a joke? Some cruel sibling prank? But the longer I stared at her, the more I realized she wasn't kidding. Her expression was steady, almost matter-of-fact. I didn't waste another second. I shot up from the couch and stormed into the kitchen, where my parents were sitting at the table sipping coffee. My voice wavered as I blurted out, "Am I adopted? Please tell me she's messing with me." My mom's reaction was immediate. Her face paled, her eyes widening like a deer caught in headlights. My dad, on the other hand, wouldn't even look at me. He stared down at his coffee mug, gripping it so tightly I thought it might crack. "What?" my mom finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. I adopted." I repeated, louder this time. She just said it like it's some open secret. "Is it true?" There was a long, unbearable silence. My mom opened her mouth to say something, then closed it again. Finally, she looked at me with an expression I'll never forget. Part guilt, part fear, part sadness. Then she whispered, "Yes, you are." 3 words. Just 3 words, but they hit like a sledgehammer. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. My vision blurred, and my chest tightened as if all the air had been sucked out of the room. "No," I said, shaking my head. "No, you're lying. This doesn't make any sense." "We were going to tell you," my mom said quickly, her voice trembling. We didn't know how. Or when." "How long have you known?" I demanded, turning to my sister, who was now standing in the doorway watching the scene unfold. "Years," she admitted, her tone unusually quiet. "I overheard them talking about it once. I didn't know how to bring it up to you." I turned back to my parents, anger and betrayal bubbling to the surface. "So, she's known for years, but you didn't think I deserved to know?" "We wanted to protect you," my dad finally spoke, his voice low and strained. "It's not like we didn't plan to tell you. We thought it would be better to wait until you were older." "Older? I'm 22. How much older were you planning to wait?" I shouted. My mom reached out as if to touch my arm, but I pulled away. "Please try to understand," she said. "We didn't mean to hurt you. We love you so much. You're our child, no matter what." "Don't," I snapped. "Don't say that like it makes everything okay." I couldn't bear to look at them anymore. I felt like a stranger in my own family, like the people I had trusted most in the world had been lying to me all along. Without another word, I stormed out of the kitchen and up to my room, slamming the door behind me. Inside, I collapsed onto my bed, my mind racing. Questions swirled in my head, each one louder than the last. Who were my biological parents? Why did they give me up? And why did my parents, no, the people who raised me, decide to keep this secret for so long? I glanced at my phone and saw a message from my sister. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean for you to find out like that." I didn't reply. I couldn't even think about her right now. The only thing I could feel was the heavy, crushing weight of betrayal. My whole life suddenly felt like a lie, and I had no idea what to do next. The hours after the revelation were a haze. I stayed locked in my room, lying on my bed and staring at the ceiling as the weight of my parents' words sank in. "Yes, you are." Those 3 words replayed in my mind on a loop, each time hitting harder than the last. My brain felt like it was on overdrive, flooded with questions I couldn't answer. Who were my biological parents? Why did they give me up? Did they ever regret it? Did they even know I existed anymore? By the time the initial shock wore off, I was furious. The anger bubbled up in waves, sharp and all-consuming. I stormed downstairs, where my parents were still sitting at the kitchen table. They looked up as I entered, their expressions tense, as if bracing for impact. Why didn't you ever tell me? I demanded, my voice trembling. Why did you let me live my whole life without knowing the truth? My mom sighed heavily, tears welling in her eyes. We didn't want to overwhelm you, she said. We always thought we'd find the right time to tell you. But then time just kept passing. That's not an excuse, I shot back. You've had over 20 years to figure out how to tell me. And you weren't even the ones to tell me. She did. I gestured toward the living room, where my sister was undoubtedly eavesdropping from the couch. My dad finally spoke, his voice steady but low. We made the decision to adopt you because we wanted to give you the best life we could. You were only a few days old when we brought you home. We loved you from the moment we saw you. That hasn't changed. I wasn't ready to let them off the hook. Who are my real parents? I asked, folding my arms. Do you even know who they are? Why they gave me up? My mom hesitated, exchanging a glance with my dad before answering. We adopted you through a private agency. It was a closed adoption, which means we don't have any direct contact or information about your biological parents. All we know is what they told us at the time, that your mother was young and couldn't raise a child on her own. Her words didn't satisfy me. They felt rehearsed, too vague to be the full truth. That's it? That's all you know? You never tried to find out more? We didn't think it was our place, my dad said quietly. I stared at them, trying to process what they were saying, or not saying. Something about their answers felt off. My mom looked too nervous, too desperate to convince me. And the way my dad avoided eye contact made my stomach churn. That night, I cornered my sister in her room. When did you find out? I asked, standing in her doorway. She sighed, setting her phone down on her desk. I overheard them talking about it when I was like 14. They were arguing in the kitchen late at night. I wasn't trying to listen, but I heard Dad say something about when we tell her and keeping her in the dark. At first, I didn't understand what they meant, but then I put it together. Why didn't you tell me? I asked, my voice tinged with betrayal. I didn't know how, she admitted, shrugging. And honestly, I thought they'd tell you eventually. I didn't think it was my place. Her words didn't make me feel any better. If anything, they deepened my sense of betrayal. How long had I been the only one living in ignorance? That night, I lay awake in bed, my mind racing. I replayed every memory I could think of, searching for clues I might have missed. Had there been signs? I thought about the time a distant aunt had commented that I didn't look like a last name, and how my mom had quickly brushed it off. Or the way people sometimes remarked on my hair or eye color and how different it was from my parents. At the time, I never thought twice about it. Now, those comments took on a whole new meaning. I started questioning everything. Every moment, every interaction, every family photo hanging on the walls suddenly felt tainted. I stared at those photos, searching for some resemblance that I had never noticed before. But the more I looked, the more I realized there wasn't one. I couldn't shake the feeling that my parents weren't telling me the whole truth. There was a hesitance in the way they spoke about my adoption, as if they were holding something back. My mom's nervous glances, my dad's silence, it all pointed to something more. I stayed up until the early hours of the morning, scrolling through online forums and articles about closed adoptions. I read stories from other adoptees, some of whom had gone their entire lives without knowing the truth. Some were able to track down their biological families. Others hit dead ends. The idea of never finding out the full story terrified me. By the time the sun came up, I had made a decision. I wasn't going to let this go. If my parents wouldn't give me the answers I needed, I'd find them myself. I had no idea where to start, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to rest until I uncovered the truth. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of determination I hadn't felt the day before. The shock had dulled, the anger had simmered, and now all I wanted was answers. Real answers. Not the vague, carefully curated tidbits my parents had been feeding me. I decided to start with the basics, the one document that might hold some kind of clue, my birth certificate. I waited until my mom was in the kitchen, sipping her morning coffee. My dad had already left for work, which I figured might make the conversation easier. Mom, I said, trying to sound as calm and non-confrontational as possible. Can I see my birth certificate? Her reaction was immediate. Her eyes widened slightly, and she froze for just a second before setting her coffee cup down. Why do you want to see that? She asked, her tone cautious. I just want to know more, I said, shrugging like it wasn't a big deal. You said the adoption was through a private agency, right? Maybe there's something on the certificate that can help me figure out where to start. She hesitated, looking down at her hands. I'm not sure where it is, she said. I'd have to look for it. It's probably in the filing cabinet in Dad's office, I said, calling her bluff. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and I could see her weighing her options. Finally, she let out a small sigh and nodded. All right, I'll get it for you. She disappeared into the office, and I paced the kitchen, my heart pounding. When she came back, she was holding a worn envelope. She handed it to me without a word, her expression unreadable. I opened the envelope and pulled out the certificate. At first glance, it looked like any other birth certificate. My name, my supposed date of birth, and the city where I was born were all there. But then I noticed something strange. The date filed field was nearly 2 weeks after my birth date. I frowned, pointing at it. Why does this say the certificate wasn't filed until almost 2 weeks later? I asked. It's probably just a clerical thing, my mom said quickly, her voice a little too casual. Sometimes paperwork takes time to process. That's not what it looks like, I said, narrowing my eyes. This doesn't make sense, Mom. 2 weeks is a long time. Was there some kind of delay with the adoption? Her face tightened. It's nothing to worry about, she said, brushing me off. These things aren't always straightforward. I stared at her, waiting for her to elaborate, but she didn't. Instead, she took a sip of her coffee and started tidying the already clean counter, clearly done with the conversation. Frustrated, I went back to my room and opened my laptop. I started researching birth certificates and adoption records, trying to figure out if the delay was as innocent as my mom claimed. The more I read, the less convinced I was. Articles and forum posts from other adoptees mentioned that delayed filing dates could indicate complications, legal disputes, hesitations from the biological parents, or issues with the adoption agency. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something they weren't telling me. If the adoption had been straightforward, why was my mom acting so cagey about something as simple as a birth certificate? By the end of the day, my frustration had boiled over. I confronted her again after dinner, holding the certificate in my hand. Mom, I need you to be honest with me, I said, my voice firm. Was there something unusual about my adoption? Did my biological parents change their minds or something? She looked visibly uncomfortable, glancing toward the doorway as if hoping my dad would walk in and save her. Honey, we've told you everything we know, she said, her tone defensive. You're making this more complicated than it needs to be. You're not telling me everything, I said, my voice rising. I can feel it. Why can't you just tell me the truth? I don't know what else you want from me, she said, her voice shaking. We've always loved you. Isn't that enough? No, I said bluntly. It's not. I deserve to know where I come from. She didn't respond, just stood there with tears brimming in her eyes. I felt a pang of guilt for pushing her, but I couldn't stop. I needed answers, and I wasn't getting them from her. That night, I went back online and dove deeper into the world of adoption records. I learned about closed adoptions, how they often left adoptees with little to no information about their biological families. But I also read about ways people had managed to track down clues, old documents, DNA tests, even social media searches. As I scrolled through page after page, I started to piece together a plan. If my parents weren't going to tell me the truth, I'd find it myself. I didn't know exactly what I was looking for yet, but I knew the birth certificate was just the beginning. The more I thought about it, the more I felt certain there was more to this story than a simple adoption. The delay on the certificate, my mom's evasiveness, and my dad's complete silence, it all added up to something bigger, something they didn't want me to know, and I was determined to find out what it was. It was a gray, drizzly afternoon, and I was holed up in my room, trying to organize my scattered thoughts about the adoption. I had spent the past few days consumed by research, combing through forums and online resources, hoping for a breakthrough. But so far, nothing tangible had emerged. I was starting to feel like I was chasing shadows, until my sister knocked on my door. Hey, she said, poking her head in. You got a second? I looked up from my laptop. She was holding something, a crinkled, yellowed envelope that looked like it had been buried in a time capsule. What's that? I asked, sitting up. She walked in and handed it to me. I found it in the attic, she said. I was looking for my old yearbooks, and this was in a box with a bunch of random stuff. It's addressed to Mom and Dad, but the name on the back, I've never seen it before. I flipped the envelope over, my heart pounding. Sure enough, there was a sender's name scrawled in faded ink, Marie. No last name, no return address. Just Marie. My sister sat down on the edge of my bed as I stared at the envelope, trying to make sense of it. Do you think it has anything to do with, she asked hesitantly. I didn't answer. Instead, I carefully opened the envelope, the paper crackling under my fingers. Inside was a single piece of folded stationery. The handwriting was neat but slightly shaky, like it had been written in a rush. I unfolded it and read the message aloud. Thank you for taking care of her. I hope she'll have a better life with you than I could give her. I'll always love her. Marie. The words hit me like a freight train. My hands started to tremble as I reread the note, my mind racing to connect the dots. Marie. Was this my biological mother? If so, why hadn't my parents ever mentioned her? And why had they hidden this letter? What does it mean? My sister asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know, I said, but even as I said the words, I felt a knot of suspicion tightening in my chest. I stood up and walked straight downstairs, the letter clutched in my hand. My parents were in the living room, watching a show. As soon as they saw me, their faces fell. They must have known something was coming. What's this? I asked, holding up the letter. My mom's eyes widened in alarm, and my dad stiffened in his chair. Where did you find that? My mom asked, her voice unsteady. In the attic, I said. Why didn't you tell me about it? My mom stood up, reaching for the letter. You weren't supposed to see that, she said, her voice trembling. It's private. Private? I shot back, pulling the letter out of her reach. It's about me, isn't it? Marie. She's my biological mother, isn't she? My mom didn't answer. She just stared at me, her face pale. My dad sat silently, his jaw clenched. Why would you hide this from me? I demanded. You've been saying this whole time that you don't know anything about her, but you have this. How long have you been lying to me? It's complicated, my mom said, her voice breaking. We didn't want to hurt you. Hurt me? I laughed bitterly. You think finding out you've been hiding this for years doesn't hurt? You should have told me. We didn't know how, my mom cried. I turned to my dad. And you? Do you have anything to say? Or are you just going to sit there and let her do all the talking? He looked at me, his expression pained. We didn't want you to feel abandoned, he said quietly. We thought it would be better if you didn't know. That wasn't your decision to make, I said, my voice shaking. I have a right to know who I am and where I come from. For a moment, no one said anything. The only sound was the muffled noise from the TV. Finally, my mom stepped closer. Please, just let this go, she said, her voice pleading. We love you. That's all that matters. No, I said firmly. It's not all that matters. I deserve the truth. I turned and walked out of the room, leaving my parents in stunned silence. Back in my room, I stared at the letter again. My emotions a whirlwind of anger, confusion, and sadness. I had so many questions, but the one that haunted me the most was, why? Why had Marie given me up? Why had my parents kept this from me? And why did it feel like they were still hiding something? My sister came in a few minutes later and sat beside me on the bed. You okay? She asked softly. No, I admitted. She didn't say anything else, just sat there with me as I tried to process everything. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept turning the letter over in my hands, rereading the words until they were etched into my mind. There was no last name, no address, no way to contact her. But the letter felt like a lifeline, a thread connecting me to a part of my life that had always been missing. I didn't know how I was going to find her, but one thing was certain. I couldn't let this go. After finding the letter from Marie and the fallout with my parents, something shifted in me. I couldn't just sit back and accept the scraps of information they had reluctantly shared. I needed real answers. That night, as I lay awake with the letter resting on my bedside table, I made a decision. I wasn't going to rely on them anymore. If they couldn't, or wouldn't, give me the truth, I'd find it myself. The first logical step was to contact the adoption agency my parents had mentioned. I wasn't sure what I'd find, but it seemed like the best place to start. The next morning, I called my mom and dad into the living room. They looked wary, probably expecting another confrontation, but I kept my tone measured. What's the name of the adoption agency? I asked. My mom hesitated, glancing at my dad. Finally, she said, it was called Family Futures. But honey, it's been a long time. I just need the name, I interrupted. Armed with that information, I spent the next few hours searching for the agency online. My optimism quickly faded. A notice on an old, clunky website informed me that Family Futures had closed more than a decade ago. I found a few references to its existence in forums, but no concrete records. It was like the agency had vanished into thin air. I tried contacting the state adoption records office, but they weren't much help either. They confirmed that Family Futures records had been transferred to another agency when it shut down. The catch? Those records were sealed, and I needed either a court order or my adoptive parents' written consent to access them. Neither option felt feasible at the moment. Frustration bubbled up inside me. Everywhere I turned, I hit a dead end. My parents had always told me how simple and straightforward my adoption was, but now it felt like an impossible maze. When traditional methods failed, I turned to the one resource I hadn't fully explored yet, the internet. Social media, to be exact. I joined every adoption-related group and forum I could find, lurking in threads and reading other people's stories. Many of them mirrored my own. Adoptees searching for their biological families, piecing together fragments of their histories with little to go on. One night, I decided to post in one of the larger forums. My hands trembled as I typed. Hi, everyone. I'm looking for information about my biological mother, who I believe is named Marie. I was born in town name, on birth date, and my adoption was handled through a now-closed agency called Family Futures. I don't have much else to go on, but any advice or resources would be appreciated. I hit post and immediately felt a mix of hope and dread. What if no one replied? Or worse, what if someone replied with information I wasn't ready to hear? To my surprise, the responses started pouring in within hours. People shared tips, offered support, and even linked me to resources I hadn't considered. Someone suggested I search local newspaper archives for birth announcements or stories about the agency. Another person recommended DNA testing services, which I bookmarked for later. But the most intriguing message came in a private chat. Hi, I saw your post. I think I might know the Marie you're looking for. She lived in town name around the time you were born, but she moved away years ago. I don't know much else, but my mom used to talk about her sometimes. Let me know if you want more details. My heart raced as I read and reread the message. It wasn't much, but it was the first real lead I'd gotten. I replied immediately, asking for anything they could remember. Marie's last name, where she might have moved, anything. While I waited for their response, I followed another lead someone had mentioned, the local library. They suggested I check old directories and newspapers for references to Marie or the agency. It felt like a long shot, but I was willing to try anything. The next day, I visited the library and explained my situation to the librarian, a kind woman who seemed genuinely interested in helping. She guided me to the archives section, where I spent hours flipping through old newspapers on microfilm. It was tedious work, my eyes growing sore from scanning page after page of outdated text. Just when I was about to give up, something caught my eye, a small ad for Family Futures in the classified section of a local paper. It listed their contact information, which was long out of date, but it also mentioned that they specialized in private adoptions for young mothers in crisis. That phrase stuck with me. Young mothers in crisis. Was that how they had described Marie when she gave me up? It was the closest thing to a clue I had found, but it still left me with more questions than answers. Later that evening, I checked my messages and saw that the person who had messaged me earlier had replied. My mom said Marie's last name might have been last name. She's not 100% sure, but she remembers Marie working at the diner downtown before she moved. Maybe someone there remembers her? I stared at the screen, my pulse quickening. A last name. It wasn't definitive, but it was a start. The next morning, I drove to the diner, feeling equal parts nervous and determined. The place looked like it hadn't changed much in decades, with its retro decor and the faint smell of frying bacon in the air. I approached the counter and explained my situation to the woman working there, an older lady who introduced herself as Nancy. Marie, she said, frowning in thought. That name does ring a bell. We had a girl named Marie working here years ago. Back in the early 90s, I think. Sweet girl, but she left town all of a sudden. Never said why. Do you remember her last name? I asked, my voice barely steady. I'm afraid I don't, she said apologetically. But I think she used to talk to one of the other waitresses, Linda. She might know more. I can give you her number if you want. I nodded eagerly, scribbling down the number Nancy gave me. It wasn't much, but it was another thread to pull. As I drove home that evening, a strange mix of hope and apprehension settled over me. For the first time, it felt like I was inching closer to the truth. I didn't know what I would find at the end of this search, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to stop until I found Marie. After hitting another wall with Linda, the former waitress Nancy mentioned, her number turned out to be disconnected. I knew I needed a new approach. I couldn't just wait for leads to magically fall into my lap. My mind kept circling back to what Nancy had said about Marie leaving town suddenly. Why would someone pack up and disappear without telling anyone why? I decided to return to the library, hoping the archives might have some clue I'd missed during my first visit. The librarian, who had helped me before, recognized me as soon as I walked in. "Back again?" she asked with a kind smile. "Yeah," I admitted. "Still looking for Marie." She nodded thoughtfully. "Have you tried yearbooks? Sometimes those can give you more context about someone, clubs they were in, activities they did. It might help you narrow down your search." I blinked. "Yearbooks? I hadn't even considered that." "That's a great idea," I said. She led me to a section of the library where the yearbooks from the local high school were stored. I quickly pulled out the volumes from the years around my birth and began flipping through the pages. My fingers tingled with anticipation as I scanned each page, hoping for a familiar name or face. It wasn't until I reached the graduating class 2 years before my parents that I finally found her. There, in crisp black and white, was a photo of a girl with dark, wavy hair and a shy smile, Marie. Her name was printed neatly beneath the photo, along with her full name, Marie Harris. My breath caught in my throat. I stared at the photo for a long time, trying to process the emotions swirling inside me. This wasn't just a name in a letter anymore. This was a real person, a young woman with hopes and dreams, just like anyone else. And she was here in my town, not long before I was born. Flipping through the yearbook, I found a few more mentions of her. She had been in the art club and sang in the choir. There was even a candid shot of her painting a mural in what looked like the school's gymnasium. But there was nothing that hinted at what might have happened to her after high school. With my heart pounding, I took a photo of her yearbook picture and name with my phone. The librarian looked over my shoulder, curious. "Did you find her?" she asked. "I think so," I said, my voice shaky. "Her name is Marie Harris. She graduated 2 years before my parents." "Marie Harris," the librarian repeated, frowning thoughtfully. "That name does sound familiar. Let me know if you need help with anything else." "Thank you," I said, gathering my things and heading home. As soon as I got back, I opened my laptop and typed Marie Harris into every search engine I could think of. But the results were disappointingly vague. There were a few obituaries, but none matched her age or location. A handful of old forum posts came up, but they were unrelated. It was as if Marie Harris had vanished into thin air after graduating high school. Frustrated but undeterred, I decided to confront my parents with what I'd found. I walked into the living room, where they were watching TV, and held up my phone with Marie's yearbook photo displayed on the screen. "Do you know her?" I asked, my voice sharp. My mom's face went pale, and my dad stiffened in his seat. Neither of them said anything for a moment, but their silence told me everything I needed to know. "Why do you have that?" my mom finally asked, her voice trembling. "Her name's Marie Harris," I said. "She graduated from your high school 2 years before you. So don't tell me you don't know her." My mom's eyes filled with tears as she looked at my dad, who still refused to meet my gaze. Finally, she took a deep breath and said, "Yes, we knew her." "You knew her?" I repeated, my anger boiling over. "You told me you didn't know anything about her. You said the adoption was through a private agency, that it was all anonymous. Were you lying this whole time?" "It's not that simple," my mom said, her voice breaking. "Please, just let me explain." I folded my arms, my heart pounding. "Go ahead. I'm listening." My mom wiped her eyes and took another deep breath. "Marie wasn't a stranger. She was my cousin." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. "Your cousin?" I echoed, my voice rising. "Yes," she said. "She and I weren't close, but we were family. She had a difficult childhood. Her parents divorced when she was young, and she moved around a lot. When she got pregnant, she was only 19 and had no support. She came to us, asking for help. That's when your dad and I made the decision to adopt you." I stared at her, my mind reeling. This wasn't just some abstract woman from my past. Marie had been part of my parents' lives, my mom's family. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, my voice cracking. "Why didn't you tell me I was related to her?" "We thought it would be easier this way," my mom said, tears streaming down her face. "We didn't want you to feel torn between 2 families. We wanted to give you a stable, happy life without any confusion." My dad finally spoke, his voice low and heavy. "We thought we were doing what was best for you," he said. "We never meant to hurt you." "Hurt me?" I could barely think straight. All this time, they had let me believe I was adopted by strangers who had no connection to my biological family. But Marie wasn't just some distant figure. She was part of my own bloodline, and they had hidden that from me. I walked out of the room, too overwhelmed to say another word. Back in my bedroom, I stared at the photo of Marie again, trying to reconcile the smiling girl in the yearbook with the mystery surrounding her life. Who was she, really? And why had she chosen to give me up? The revelation changed everything. Marie wasn't just a name in a letter or a photo in a yearbook. She was family. And now, more than ever, I needed to find her. The revelation that Marie was my mom's cousin and my biological mother felt like the final betrayal. I spent the next few days replaying every family gathering, every holiday dinner, every shared laugh and story, wondering how no one had ever let it slip. How could they have kept this from me for my entire life? I couldn't bring myself to talk to my parents immediately. I avoided them, retreating to my room and immersing myself in anything that didn't remind me of them. But the questions in my mind only grew louder. Did my grandparents know? Did my aunts and uncles? How far did this secret go? Finally, one evening, I couldn't hold it in any longer. I marched downstairs and found my parents in the living room. They looked up at me with weary expressions, as if they had been expecting this moment. "I need you to tell me everything," I said, my voice steady but firm. "No more half-truths, no more dodging questions. I want the full story." My mom hesitated, glancing at my dad, who nodded slightly as if giving her permission. She gestured for me to sit, but I stayed standing, arms crossed. "Marie and I grew up together," my mom began. "We weren't close. She lived in another state for most of her childhood, but we'd see each other during the summers when her family came to visit. She was different, quiet, artistic, always a little sad. Her parents had a messy divorce when she was a teenager, and I think that affected her a lot." I nodded, urging her to continue. "When she was 19, she showed up on our doorstep out of the blue. She was pregnant. She said she didn't have anywhere else to go, that she couldn't go back to her parents. She was scared and alone." My mom's voice wavered, and she paused to compose herself. "We let her stay with us," my dad added. "We tried to help her figure out what to do, but she was adamant that she couldn't raise a child. She didn't have the money, the support, or the stability. She was determined to give you up for adoption." My heart ached hearing this. I couldn't imagine the fear and desperation Marie must have felt, but it didn't make the next part of the story any easier to hear. "That's when we made the decision to adopt you," my mom said. "She wanted to make sure you'd be with people who loved you, people she trusted. We thought it was the best solution for everyone. You'd stay in the family, and she could move on with her life. But why keep it a secret?" I demanded. "Why lie to me my entire life?" "We thought it would be easier for you," my mom said, tears brimming in her eyes. "We wanted to protect you from the confusion, from feeling torn between two families." And Marie agreed. She said she didn't want to complicate things for you. "That wasn't your decision to make," I snapped. "I had a right to know the truth." "We realize that now," my dad said quietly. "But at the time, we thought we were doing the right thing." I shook my head, pacing the room. "Did she ever try to contact me? To see me?" My mom hesitated again, and that hesitation told me everything I needed to know. "She did," she admitted. "A few times. She sent letters, called a couple of times. But we didn't think it was a good idea. We thought it would confuse you, and we didn't want to disrupt your life." "You shut her out," I said, my voice trembling with anger. "You kept her from me." "We were trying to protect you," my dad said again, but the words felt hollow. I couldn't take it anymore. "You didn't protect me. You robbed me of the chance to know her. You decided for me, and that's not fair." The room fell silent. My parents looked devastated, but I didn't feel any sympathy. "Not then. I'm going to find her," I said finally. "I don't care what it takes. I'm going to find her." My mom's face crumpled. "Please, just be careful," she said. I didn't answer. I went back to my room and shut the door, my mind racing. Marie had tried to reach out, and my parents had stopped her. That hurt more than anything else. What had she wanted to say to me? Did she want to explain why she gave me up? Did she regret it? I spent hours researching Marie Harris online, hoping to find a lead I had missed before. I searched through social media, old newspaper archives, and even obituaries, but it was as if she had disappeared off the face of the earth. The next day, I reached out to my sister, who had been uncharacteristically quiet throughout this whole ordeal. I told her everything my parents had admitted, and to my surprise, she was just as shocked and angry as I was. "They should have told you," she said. "I don't get why they thought keeping it a secret was a good idea." "Do you remember ever meeting her?" I asked. She shook her head. "No. But then again, if she was here before you were born, I was probably too young to remember." Her words sparked an idea. If Marie had stayed with my parents during her pregnancy, maybe there were old photos, letters, or other keepsakes tucked away somewhere in the house. something they had forgotten to hide, or didn't think to. That night, when my parents went to bed, I started searching. I combed through the attic, the basement, and the storage closet where my mom kept old family albums. At first, I found nothing but dusty photo books and forgotten Christmas decorations. But just as I was about to give up, I stumbled across a small, unmarked box tucked in the back of a shelf in the basement. Inside were a few faded photographs, a handful of letters, and a hospital bracelet with a tiny, handwritten tag that read Baby Girl Harris. My hands trembled as I sifted through the contents, piecing together fragments of a story I had never been told. One of the photos showed a young woman, Marie, sitting on a porch, her hand resting protectively on her pregnant belly. She looked so young, so vulnerable. Another photo showed her holding a newborn baby, me, in her arms, her expression a mix of exhaustion and tenderness. I clutched the photos to my chest, tears streaming down my face. For the first time, I saw Marie not as a distant figure but as a real person. My mother. The letters in the box were addressed to my parents, each one filled with updates about her life after leaving town. She wrote about the jobs she had taken, the places she had lived, and how much she missed me. Her words were filled with longing and heartbreak. I knew then that I couldn't stop until I found her. I needed to hear her story in her own words, to understand the decisions she had made, and to finally fill the void that had been left in my heart. After days of relentless searching, a potential lead finally surfaced. A Marie Harris, listed at an address in a modest city 2 hours away, matched the age and timeline I was looking for. It felt like a fragile thread in a sea of dead ends, but it was enough for me to act. I didn't want to show up at her doorstep unannounced, especially since I couldn't even be sure this Marie was the one I'd been searching for. Instead, I decided to write her a letter. It took me hours to find the right words. How do you approach someone who might be your biological mother after decades of silence? I didn't want to overwhelm her or make her feel trapped, but I also didn't want to be vague or impersonal. Eventually, I sealed the envelope, added my phone number and email, and sent it off. The waiting was unbearable. Days passed with no response, and I started to doubt myself. Maybe she had moved. Maybe she wasn't the right Marie. Maybe she saw the letter, panicked, and threw it away. I tried not to think about the worst-case scenarios, but they crept in during quiet moments. Then, a week later, my phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number. My heart stopped as I stared at the screen, unsure if I could answer. Gathering every ounce of courage, I swiped to pick up the call. Hello? My voice wavered. There was a pause, then a shaky voice on the other end. Hi, is this your name? Yes, I said, my chest tightening. Who's this? It's Marie. The room seemed to spin. I gripped the edge of the counter to steady myself. Marie? I whispered, barely able to get the word out. Yes, she said, her voice trembling. I got your letter. I'm your mother. Tears welled in my eyes as I stood frozen, the weight of her words sinking in. I didn't know what to say, so I just listened as she continued. I've thought about you every day, she said. I always hoped you'd find me, but I didn't want to disrupt your life. When I saw your letter, I can't tell you what it meant to me. I managed to find my voice, though it came out uneven. I've been looking for you, I said. I've spent my whole life wondering about you. We talked for hours, our conversation raw and emotional. Marie told me about her life, how she had been a scared 19-year-old with no support and no way to raise a baby. Her parents had been furious when she got pregnant, and the father had disappeared as soon as she told him. I didn't want to give you up, she said, her voice breaking, but I knew I couldn't give you the life you deserved. She explained how she had moved away shortly after the adoption, trying to start fresh. She sent letters to my parents in the years after I was born, but when they didn't respond, she assumed they didn't want her involved. I thought you were better off without me, she admitted, the pain in her voice palpable. But I never stopped thinking about you. By the end of the call, she asked the question I had been hoping for. Would you like to meet in person? Yes, I said without hesitation. We decided to meet at a park near her home. The days leading up to the meeting were a blur of nervous energy. I kept rehearsing what I would say, imagining every possible scenario, but nothing could prepare me for the reality of seeing her. When I arrived at the park, I spotted her immediately. She was sitting on a bench under a large oak tree, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her hair was streaked with gray, and her face bore the lines of time and hardship, but she was still beautiful. There was something hauntingly familiar about her. The way she held herself, the way she scanned the park as though searching for something or someone. I approached slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. When our eyes met, she stood up, her hands trembling at her sides. "It's you," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "It's me," I said, barely able to speak. For a moment, we just stood there, taking each other in. Then she opened her arms, and I stepped into her embrace. It was a feeling I couldn't put into words, both foreign and familiar, like finding a piece of myself that had been missing for years. We sat on the bench and talked for hours. She told me more about her life, her love of painting, and how she had carried the guilt of giving me up for decades. "I painted this mural in high school," she said, smiling wistfully. "It was a mother and child. I think I was already dreaming of you back then, even before I knew you existed." She answered every question I had, even the difficult ones. She told me about my biological father, a fleeting relationship she regretted but didn't blame. She spoke about her struggles, jobs that barely paid the bills, nights spent wondering if I was happy, if I was loved. But what struck me most was the way she looked at me. Her eyes brimmed with pride, sorrow, and love all at once. It was as if she were memorizing every detail of my face, as though afraid this moment might slip away. As the sun began to set, she reached into her bag and handed me a small package. Inside was a painting, a vibrant, swirling depiction of a mother holding her child. "I painted this after you were born," she said, her voice trembling. "I carried it with me everywhere, hoping one day I'd get to give it to you." I stared at the painting, tears streaming down my face. It was beautiful, achingly so. "Thank you," I whispered, my voice breaking. "Thank you for finding me," she said, her hand covering mine. Meeting Marie wasn't the end of my search for answers. It was the beginning of something new. As I left the park that evening, the weight I had been carrying for so long began to lift. For the first time in my life, I felt a sense of completeness, a connection to the past that had always eluded me. I had found her, and in finding her, I had found myself. Meeting Marie had been an emotional whirlwind, but as I drove home from the park that evening, a sense of calm settled over me. For the first time, the questions that had haunted me for years weren't just echoes in the dark. I had answers now, real ones. And while they weren't easy to hear, they gave me a new sense of clarity about who I was and where I came from. Marie had opened up completely, holding nothing back as we talked. She told me that giving me up had been the hardest decision of her life. "I loved you so much," she had said, her voice trembling. "But love wasn't enough. I didn't have the money, the stability, or the support to raise a baby. Your parents, your mom and dad, they gave me hope that you'd have a better life, one I couldn't give you." Hearing those words didn't erase the pain of her absence, but they helped me understand her choice. It wasn't about rejection or abandonment. It was about sacrifice. She had made a decision no mother should have to make, and she had lived with the consequences ever since. But as much as her explanations soothed one part of me, they stirred up new emotions, too. I couldn't help but think about my adoptive parents and the choices they had made. They had raised me, loved me, given me a life filled with opportunities, and yet they had also lied to me for decades. That betrayal still stung. Over the next few weeks, I spent more time with Marie, slowly piecing together the story of my origins. She showed me old photos of her family, faded snapshots of her as a teenager, smiling shyly in front of a small house with peeling paint. She pointed out a picture of her mother, my biological grandmother, who had passed away years ago. "She would have loved you," Marie said softly. Looking at those photos, I began to notice things I had never seen before. The curve of Marie's smile was eerily similar to mine. The way she tilted her head when she was lost in thought mirrored a quirk I had always been teased for. For the first time, I saw myself in someone else, and it was both comforting and surreal. Marie also shared stories about her life after she gave me up. She had moved to a new city, taken odd jobs, and eventually pursued her passion for painting. She showed me some of her artwork, landscapes, abstract pieces, and portraits that seemed to carry an undercurrent of longing. "This one," she said, pointing to a painting of a young girl standing at the edge of a forest, "I painted a year after I gave you up. I used to imagine what you might look like, what kind of person you'd become. I always hoped you'd be happy." Her words brought tears to my eyes. I had spent so much of my life feeling like a puzzle with missing pieces, but now, those pieces were starting to fall into place. My quirks and passions, the love I had for art, the way I found solace in quiet moments, didn't feel so random anymore. They were threads connecting me to Marie. At the same time, I couldn't ignore the complicated emotions I still felt toward my adoptive parents. While I was grateful for everything they had done for me, I couldn't shake the anger and hurt over the secrets they had kept. They had robbed me of the chance to know Marie sooner, to have a fuller understanding of my identity. I knew I couldn't move forward without addressing those feelings. One evening, I asked my parents if we could talk. They looked apprehensive but agreed. We sat in the living room, the tension between us palpable. "I've been spending time with Marie," I began, watching their faces carefully. My mom's eyes widened slightly, and my dad shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I'm glad you found her," my mom said hesitantly. "We always hoped you would someday." "That's the thing," I said, my voice steady but firm. "You say you hoped I'd find her, but you didn't exactly make it easy. You hid her letters, you lied about not knowing her, and you made decisions for me that weren't yours to make." "Why?" My mom looked down at her hands, her expression pained. "We were scared," she admitted. "We thought that if you knew about her, you'd feel torn. We didn't want you to think we were less of a family because you had another one out there." "But I deserve to know," I said, my voice rising slightly. "You decided for me, and that's not fair. It wasn't your choice to make." "We see that now," my dad said quietly. "We were wrong to keep it from you. We thought we were protecting you, but we realize now that we were just protecting ourselves." There was a long silence as I let their words sink in. I could see the guilt etched into their faces, and for the first time, I realized that their actions, while deeply flawed, had come from a place of fear and love. "I'm not saying I don't appreciate everything you've done for me," I said finally, "but you have to understand how much this hurt me. You kept me from knowing who I really am." "We're sorry," my mom said, tears streaming down her face. "We can't change the past, but we want to support you now, whatever that looks like." Her words felt sincere, and while they didn't erase the pain, they softened it. I realized that forgiveness wouldn't happen overnight, but it could start here, with this conversation. As the weeks went on, my relationship with my parents began to heal, slowly but surely. I continued to see Marie, learning more about her and about myself in the process. For the first time, I didn't feel like a stranger in my own life. Meeting Marie had given me a new perspective, not just on my adoption, but on family, love, and identity. It showed me that the truth, no matter how messy or painful, was always worth seeking. And while my journey wasn't over, I finally felt like I was moving toward a place of peace. Sitting across from my parents that evening, I could feel the weight of everything we had left unsaid for far too long. The living room felt smaller than usual, the silence between us heavy and expectant. I had rehearsed this conversation in my head 100 times, but now that it was here, the words felt tangled in my throat. "I need to talk to you," I began, my voice quieter than I intended. They both nodded, their faces etched with worry. My mom reached for my dad's hand, and he gave it a reassuring squeeze. "I've been spending time with Marie," I said, watching their reactions carefully. My mom's eyes welled up immediately, and my dad's jaw tightened, but neither of them spoke. "And I need to tell you how I feel about everything. About the secrets, the lies, all of it." I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. When I first found out I was adopted, it felt like my entire world fell apart. I trusted you completely, and suddenly, I wasn't sure if I could anymore. The fact that you knew Marie and kept that from me for so long, it hurt. It still hurts. My mom started to say something, but I held up a hand to stop her. "Please, let me finish. I know you thought you were protecting me, and I understand that. But this was my life, my story, and you took away my right to know it." Tears streamed down my mom's face as she nodded, her lips trembling. "You're right," she said softly. "We should have told you. We should have told you everything." My dad leaned forward, his voice steady but tinged with regret. "We were scared. Scared that if you knew about Marie, if you felt a connection to her, you'd pull away from us. We didn't want to lose you." His words hit me hard. As much as their choices had hurt me, I couldn't ignore the love and fear that had motivated them. I could see now that their actions, though flawed, had come from a place of deep devotion. "You didn't have to be scared," I said, my voice breaking. "I'm not going anywhere. You're my parents. You'll always be my parents. But I needed to know the truth, about Marie, about myself. I deserved that." "We're so sorry," my mom whispered, reaching across the coffee table to take my hand. "We were wrong. We see that now, and we'll do whatever it takes to make it right." I squeezed her hand, my own tears finally spilling over. "I want us to move forward," I said, "but it's going to take time. I need you to understand that." "Of course," my dad said, "whatever you need." In that moment, something shifted between us. The pain and anger didn't disappear. It would take time to heal, but for the first time, I felt like we were on the same side, working toward understanding rather than avoidance. In the weeks that followed, we began the slow process of rebuilding our trust. My parents didn't shy away from the difficult conversations anymore, and they were open to hearing about my time with Marie. It wasn't always easy. There were moments of tension and lingering resentment, but we kept showing up for each other, and that made all the difference. At the same time, my relationship with Marie continued to grow. We started meeting regularly, sometimes for long talks over coffee, other times for quiet afternoons spent looking through old photos or walking in the park. She shared stories about her childhood, her struggles, and her dreams, and I shared pieces of my life with her, too. One day, I brought Marie to meet my parents. It was awkward at first, with years of unspoken tension hanging in the air, but as the evening went on, something beautiful happened. My mom and Marie started talking, not about the past, but about me. They shared stories, laughed at my quirks, and for the first time, I felt like all the fractured pieces of my life were coming together. Integrating Marie into my life wasn't always smooth, but it was worth it. She didn't try to replace my parents, and they didn't see her as a threat. Instead, we found a balance, a way to honor the roles each of them had played in shaping who I was. As the months turned into a year, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened. Discovering I was adopted had been a shock, a seismic shift in the foundation of my identity. But it had also been a gift. It had forced me to confront the truth, to seek out answers, and to connect with people I never would have known otherwise. I learned that family isn't just about biology or the roles people play. It's about love, forgiveness, and the willingness to grow together, even when it's hard. My parents weren't perfect, but neither was I. And in the end, we chose to face the imperfections together. Marie became a part of my life, not as a replacement for what I already had, but as an addition to it. She gave me a deeper understanding of myself, a link to my past that I had been missing. And in return, I gave her the chance to know the person I had become, the person she had always hoped I would be. Looking back, I wouldn't change a thing. The journey had been painful and messy, but it had also been transformative. It taught me the value of truth, the power of reconciliation, and the importance of knowing where you come from. For the first time, I felt whole, and for that, I was grateful.